That little girl unmasks a criminal in the Millionaire'S family. They didn't want to believe her, but when they discover everything, they are shocked. Comment. Giving my story a rating from 0 to 10, your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The screams sliced through the muggy afternoon air like a razor, echoing through the narrow streets of the historic town. The 52-year-old millionaire nearly dropped his coffee cup as he stepped away from the window of his luxurious apartment. It was always at the same time, always with the same desperate intensity that made his chest tighten inexplicably. For 3 weeks straight, that sound had been coming from the colonial house across the street, a faded yellow 2-story building with peeling blue shutters that contrasted starkly with the modern elegance of the building where he lived. As the owner of one of the largest construction companies in the region, the businessman was used to solving complex problems involving millions in stocks and investments, but he preferred to stay away from other people's dramas. Especially after 5 years of living alone, ever since he lost his wife on a rainy night, he preferred not to remember. His millions seemed endless, but all that money couldn't buy back the peace he had lost along with her. Across the street, inside the colonial house that smelled of mildew and cheap liquor, the 4-year-old girl huddled in the corner of the dark kitchen. Her big eyes were insufficient to understand why her aunt hated her so much, why each day brought new physical pain that made her little body tremble with fear. The 38-year-old woman firmly held a metal spoon that she had heated on the wood-burning stove. Her eyes, bloodshot from alcohol, were fixed on the child, who was trembling before her like an injured bird. "You're a plague on this house," hissed the aunt, her voice slurred from the cheap vodka she had been drinking since noon at the corner bar, O'Malley's. "Because of you, my sister is gone. Because of you, I lost everything." The spoon came down hard on the girl's small arm, leaving a red mark that would join the other scars that dotted her thin arms. The child bit her lip to avoid screaming louder, having learned that screams only enraged the aunt, who had worked at City Hall until she was fired for constant absences caused by her addiction. The girl closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's soft voice singing that lullaby before bed. It was all that was left of her now. Fragments of memories and a melody that insisted on echoing in her mind in the most painful moments. "Stop whimpering," the aunt grunted, putting the spoon back in the drawer, as if it were the most natural gesture in the world. "Go to your room, and I don't want to see you until tomorrow, and if you get charcoal on the walls again, you'll see what real punishment is." The girl ran to the small room at the back of the house, a stuffy space with an old bed and a crucifix on the wall. There, she curled up in the thin sheet and began to hum her mother's lullaby softly, the only thing that still comforted her. She didn't know that across the street, someone had finally paid attention to that melody that cut through the silence like a cry for help. The millionaire stopped reviewing his company's contracts when he heard the faint but distinct sound. He knew that song. His wife used to sing it when she was cooking, a popular folk song about free birds flying away from pain. He approached the window again, his eyes scanning the deteriorated facade of the colonial house. One of the back windows was ajar, and from there came that childish voice, tremulous but persistent, full of a sadness that made his heart clench. For the first time in 3 weeks, the businessman felt something different from simple annoyance. There was something in that voice that touched a sensitive chord in his chest, something that reminded him of responsibilities long buried under layers of obsessive work and emotional isolation. In the house next to the colonial one, the 61-year-old retired teacher was watering her begonias when she heard the girl singing. Unlike the millionaire, she could no longer ignore the signs that her 40 years of experience teaching children had taught her to recognize. During her 4 decades in elementary school, she had developed a keen instinct for children in distress, and that voice carried a pain that made her heart break into small pieces. The educator dried her hands on her apron and made a decision that would change everything. The next morning, she would pay a courtesy visit to her neighbor. It had been a long time since she had spoken properly with the troubled woman, and perhaps it was time to get to know the little girl who lived in that house where the silence was broken only by cries of pain better. Meanwhile, the millionaire remained at the window of his luxurious apartment, an uncomfortable feeling growing in his chest like a shadow. The music had stopped, but something in those few minutes had awakened memories that he preferred to keep dormant. Memories of a former employee who had abruptly resigned 5 years ago, a few months before the accident that took his wife. The woman was kind, always humming while organizing the construction company's files. Then, suddenly, she had simply disappeared from his life, leaving only a formal resignation letter and many unanswered questions. The sun began to set over the mountains when the girl finally fell asleep, exhausted by pain and fear. Her little fingers clutched the dirty sheet, and in her dreams she flew like the birds she secretly drew on the kitchen walls with pieces of charcoal found in the backyard. The night fell on the historic town, but the echo of that children's song continued to resonate in the mind of a man who had spent 5 years running away from his responsibilities, accumulating wealth and assets, while a child suffered across his window, waiting for someone to finally pay attention to her silent cries for help. The next morning brought with it the aroma of fresh bread from the local bakeries and the typical movement of the historic town awakening for another day. The retired teacher put on her best floral dress and combed her grey hair with extra care. There was something in that child's voice that didn't leave her alone, an echo of hopelessness that she recognized from her years as an educator. At 9 o'clock sharp, she knocked on the door of the colonial house. The sound echoed through the silent interior until shuffling footsteps approached. The aunt opened the door with a swollen face and red eyes, clearly suffering the effects of the previous night's drinking. "Good morning," said the teacher with her gentlest smile. "I came to pay a courtesy visit. It's been so long since we've talked properly." The woman hesitated, running her hand through her disheveled hair. "It's not a good time. The house is a mess." "Nonsense, dear. We've been neighbors for so long." The educator took a step forward, forcing the aunt to retreat. "And I would very much like to meet your niece. I heard she's an adorable little girl." The aunt's face hardened for a moment before forcing a weak smile. "The girl is sick. High fever. Better not to get close." At that moment, a soft noise came from the kitchen, the sound of something being dragged on the floor. The teacher pricked up her ears, immediately recognizing the sound of a child trying to move silently. "Maybe I can help," insisted the educator. "I have experience with sick children. Raised 3 of my own. You know how it is." "No need, really," the aunt replied quickly, blocking the entrance with her body. "I already took her to the doctor. It's just a cold. It'll pass soon." The teacher noticed the woman's nervous hands, the way she avoided eye contact, and especially the strong smell of alcohol emanating from her even so early in the day. All the signs she had learned to recognize during decades of dealing with troubled families. Across the street, the millionaire watched the scene from his window while having breakfast. He had woken up earlier than usual, disturbed by confusing dreams, where a child's voice mixed with painful memories. When he saw the teacher at the door of the colonial house, a strange curiosity washed over him. The educator finally said goodbye to the aunt, but not before casting an investigative glance into the interior of the house. There was something deeply wrong there, and her experience told her that a child was suffering. As she walked back to her house, she decided that she needed to find a way to verify her suspicions. Inside the colonial house, the aunt locked the door hard and went to the kitchen, where she found the girl crouching behind the table, trying to hide. The child had tried to reach a glass of water from the sink, but her height did not allow it, and she had knocked over a chair in the process. "Didn't I tell you to stay in your room?" the aunt growled, her irritation intensified by the hangover and the unexpected visit. "I was thirsty," murmured the girl, her big eyes fixed on the floor. "Thirsty?" The aunt laughed bitterly. "You want water? Then go get it in the backyard. And since you like making so much noise, you can stay out there until I decide you can come in." The girl went out to the small backyard, a space surrounded by high walls and dominated by a single tree. There, she sat on the dry earth and began to draw with a piece of charcoal that she had found near the wood-burning stove. It was always birds. Small, large, some flying, others perched on imaginary branches. Each stroke represented her dream of freedom, of flying away from that house where pain was her only constant companion. The hours passed slowly under the strong midday sun. The aunt had locked the back door, leaving the child in the backyard without water or food. The girl began to feel dizzy, but she knew that knocking on the door would only result in more punishment. So she began to hum her mother's lullaby softly, the melody being her only source of comfort. It was this melody that reached the millionaire's ears again. This time he couldn't ignore it. There was something too familiar in that voice, in that specific song that stirred up buried memories. He picked up his cell phone and, almost without thinking, started recording. He didn't know exactly why, but an instinct told him that he might need that evidence. While recording, fragments of memories began to fit together in his mind, like pieces of a macabre puzzle. The employee who had worked for him hummed that same song while organizing documents. The kind woman who always spoke fondly about her little daughter, a girl named... Her daughter was named that, the businessman murmured, the cell phone trembling in his hands. The realization hit him like a punch in the stomach. The child suffering in the house across the street was the daughter of his former employee, the woman who had worked for him for 3 years before simply disappearing. How hadn't he made that connection before? The millionaire put away his cell phone and began to walk back and forth in his luxurious apartment. He vaguely remembered the employee mentioning family problems, a sister she didn't get along with, financial difficulties that she tried to solve with her modest salary. But he was so absorbed in his own problems at the time, the growing conflicts with his wife, the problems in the company, the pressure of investments and the stock market, that he hadn't paid due attention. Now, 5 years later, the woman's daughter was across the street, and from the sounds coming from that house, she was not in a good situation. The guilt that the businessman carried for the loss of his wife multiplied, now including regret for not having helped the employee when she clearly needed it. His accumulated wealth in applications and investment funds had served for nothing when it really mattered. At 3 o'clock sharp, the screams started again. This time, the millionaire did not turn away from the window. He watched with growing horror as through the kitchen window of the colonial house he saw a female silhouette moving aggressively. He picked up his cell phone again and started recording, this time with more determination. What he saw through the cell phone screen made him nauseous. The aunt was holding something in her hands. It seemed to be a kitchen utensil, and gesturing violently towards a small figure that he could barely distinguish. The girl's screams echoed through the afternoon, and this time the businessman couldn't pretend they were just childish tantrums. When the silence returned, he remained at the window for a few more minutes, his heart pounding in his chest. He had just witnessed something that would change everything. His fortune in bitcoins and his profits from stocks seemed insignificant in the face of the brutal reality unfolding a few feet from his window. The question now was, what would he do with this information? How could a man who had spent 5 years running away from emotional responsibilities find the courage to act when a child desperately needed help? That night, the girl slept on the floor of the backyard, where the aunt had left her as punishment for making too much noise during the afternoon. The child curled up in her own dirty t-shirt and looked at the stars through the branches of the tree. In her 4-year-old mind, She made a silent wish to her mother, wherever she was, that someone, anyone, would take her away from that place of pain. Across the street, the millionaire couldn't sleep, tormented by the certainty that he needed to act, but paralyzed by the same emotional inertia that had consumed him since his wife left. His net worth of millions meant nothing if he couldn't use his resources to save a child who was literally crying out for help. 3 days had passed since the millionaire discovered the identity of the child, and guilt consumed him like a slow fire burning in his chest. During those days, he had systematically documented the episodes of violence, always at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, always with the same methodical brutality that made his stomach churn. His collection of videos and audios grew on his cell phone as evidence of his own cowardice, but his courage to act remained paralyzed by the same hesitation that had haunted him since the night he lost his wife. All the money accumulated in investments and stock market shares seemed useless in the face of his inability to make a simple decision. That Thursday morning, the retired teacher made a decision that would change everything. She had spent the night awake, tormented by the certainty that a child was suffering just a few feet from her house. Her 4 decades as an educator had taught her to recognize the signs, and they were all present in the colonial house. She decided to approach the situation differently. Instead of attempting another direct visit to the alcoholic aunt, she opted for a more subtle strategy. At 7 in the morning, she positioned herself in the side yard of her house, the place from where she had the best view of the backyard of the colonial house. What she saw horrified her beyond any expectation. The girl was sitting under the tree, completely alone, wearing only a torn t-shirt and dirty underwear. Her small arms were marked by obvious burns, some still red and inflamed like open wounds. The child was drawing in the dirt with a piece of charcoal, creating shapes that the teacher recognized as birds. There were dozens of them scattered on the ground, some erased by the previous night's rain, others fresh and detailed with the care that only a child desperate to escape reality could have. "My God," whispered the educator, her hands trembling as she held the fence that separated the yards. It was worse than she had imagined. Much worse than her worst nightmares about child neglect. The girl looked up and saw the woman watching her. For a moment, the two stared at each other in absolute silence. Then, to the teacher's surprise, the child smiled, a weak but genuine smile, and waved shyly with her thin little hand. "Hi, Grandma," said the girl with her tiny voice, using the affectionate term she gave to all the elderly ladies she met. "Hi, sweetheart," replied the educator, struggling to keep her voice steady while her heart broke. "Are you okay?" The girl glanced quickly at the windows of the house before answering, a gesture of fear that revealed years of conditioning to terror. "Yes, I am. I'm just drawing birds." "That's nice. Do you like birds?" "I like them a lot. They can fly wherever they want," replied the child, her big eyes shining with a sadness that broke the teacher's heart into 1,000 pieces. At that moment, the aunt's harsh voice echoed from inside the house like thunder. "Where are you, girl?" The terror that instantly took over the child's face said everything the educator needed to know. The girl got up quickly, wiped her hands on her t-shirt, and ran inside the house, but not before looking once more at the teacher with an expression that silently cried for help. The educator remained in the yard for a few more minutes, processing what she had seen. The burns, the animal fear, the way the child reacted to the aunt's voice, everything confirmed her worst fears about systematic abuse. Meanwhile, across the street, the millionaire had witnessed the entire interaction through his window. He was able to see the backyard partially, and the sight of the marks on the girl's arms made him physically sick. For the first time in 5 years, he felt genuine fury burning in his chest like molten lava. The former employee had trusted him in some way. Even if indirectly, even if he didn't know it at the time, she had left her daughter in the care of a family that lived in the same town where he lived. And now that child was being tortured while he watched from his comfortable window, paralyzed by his own cowardice. At 11 in the morning, the teacher made a courageous decision that would change everything. She put on her best dress clothes, took a tray of homemade cookies that she had prepared as a pretext, and headed again to the colonial house. This time, she would not take no for an answer. The aunt answered the door reluctantly, clearly irritated by the persistence of her persistent neighbor. "I already said it's not a good time." "Honey, I brought some cookies I made yesterday," interrupted the educator with a firmness that came from decades commanding classrooms. "And I insist on getting to know the little one better. As old neighbors, it is our duty to support each other." Before the aunt could protest, the teacher had already entered the house, using all the authority that decades of experience had given her. The interior of the colonial house was dark and smelled of mold mixed with cheap liquor and something rotten that she couldn't identify. Old and poorly maintained furniture occupied the room, and there was a heavy atmosphere that made the air seem difficult to breathe. Empty bottles of cheap vodka were scattered in the corners, some broken, others serving as makeshift ashtrays. "The girl is sleeping," lied the aunt, blocking the way to the back of the house with her trembling body. "What a pity." "Maybe another time, then," said the teacher, but her experienced eyes had already catalogued several disturbing details. Dark stains on the kitchen floor that seemed to have been poorly cleaned, a metal spoon left on the stove still with soot marks, and mainly small charcoal drawings on the walls that had clearly been made by a child. At that moment, a low sound came from the direction of the kitchen, a muffled sob almost imperceptible, but unmistakable for someone who had experience with traumatized children. The educator and the aunt froze. The silence that followed was tense and revealing. "Must be the neighbor's cat," said the aunt quickly, but her voice trembled slightly, betraying her nervousness. The teacher smiled and nodded, but had decided that she had already seen enough evidence to confirm her suspicions. "Well, I'll let you rest then. But remember that I'm always here next door if you need anything. Anything at all." The educator's tone made it clear that it was not just a casual offer of help. It was a subtle but direct warning that she knew something was wrong and would not ignore it. After the teacher left, the aunt locked the door hard and went to the kitchen, where she found the girl curled up behind the wood-burning stove, trying to hide like an injured animal. The child had cried upon hearing the teacher's gentle voice, remembering the kindness she had once known when her parents were still alive. "You were making noise," accused the aunt, her eyes already shining with the familiar fury that preceded the moments of violence. "No, Auntie, I didn't make noise," protested the girl, but her small voice sounded weak even to her. The aunt picked up the metal spoon that was on the stove and placed it directly on the blue flame. The girl recognized the macabre ritual and began to tremble like a leaf in the wind. She knew exactly what was coming next. "You want to attract attention, don't you?" hissed the woman as the spoon heated up until it turned red. "You want the neighbors to come here and ask questions. Do you think I don't know how to take care of you?" Across the street, the millionaire had positioned his cell phone in the window and was recording again. This time, he managed to capture not only the sounds, but also partial images through the kitchen window. What he saw made him make a decision that would change everything forever. He could no longer be just a silent observer, accumulating wealth while an innocent child suffered. The former employee had been a good person, a dedicated woman who always spoke of her daughter with unconditional love. That child was his responsibility now, whether he wanted it or not. While the girl suffered another episode of systematic torture, the businessman made a call that he hadn't made in months. He called his personal lawyer and old college friend, a man he trusted completely. "Robert, I need your help with a delicate situation," he said, watching through the window as the child's screams echoed through the afternoon like a waking nightmare. "It's about a child, and I think it may be a matter of life." That night, After the aunt fell asleep drunk on the living room sofa, the girl managed to slip silently into the backyard. Her new burns burned like embers on her skin, but the physical pain was less than the pain in her broken heart. She sat under the tree and looked at the stars, humming her mother's lullaby softly. What she didn't know was that for the first time in months, someone was truly paying attention to her suffering, and that, in the coming days, her life would change in ways she couldn't even imagine in her wildest dreams. The lawyer arrived at the Millionaire's apartment on Friday morning with a grave expression on his face. The two men had been colleagues at the university almost 3 decades ago, and the lawyer knew well the emotional isolation that his friend had built after the loss of his wife. Therefore, the urgent phone call from the night before had surprised him so much. "I need you to tell me exactly what's going on," said the lawyer, sitting in the spacious living room of the apartment. "You spoke about a child in danger, but I need details." The businessman poured coffee and stood near the window, the place that had become his obsession in recent days. "The girl who lives in the house across the street is the daughter of a former employee of mine. She is being mistreated by the aunt who takes care of her." "Mistreated how?" asked the lawyer, taking a notepad out of his briefcase. "Burns, daily screams, total neglect." The millionaire paused, struggling with the words that burned his throat. "I have recordings, evidence of what's happening." The lawyer was silent for a moment, processing the information with the seriousness that the case required. "This is very serious. If you have evidence of child abuse, you need to contact Child Protective Services immediately." "I know," replied the businessman, running his hands over his tired face. "But there's something more. The employee worked for me for 3 years. She left abruptly 5 years ago, a few months before the accident with my wife. I never understood why, but now you feel responsible," completed the lawyer, understanding the emotional complexity of the situation that tormented his friend. The millionaire nodded, his fortune accumulated in funds and applications, seeming insignificant in the face of the guilt he carried. "If I had paid more attention at the time, maybe I could have helped. Maybe she wouldn't have needed to leave her daughter with this woman." At that moment, the familiar sound of screams echoed from the house across the street, even though it was only 9 in the morning. Both men turned to the window, and the lawyer could see the expression of deep anguish on his friend's face. "This happens every day?" he asked, horrified by the brutality he could hear even from afar. "At 3 in the afternoon, religiously, but sometimes also at other times," replied the businessman, picking up his cell phone with trembling hands. "Do you want to see the recordings?" The lawyer watched the videos in growing silence, his face paling with each violent scene. As a lawyer specializing in family law, he had seen many cases of child abuse throughout his career, but something in the systematization of that violence disturbed him deeply. "We can't wait any longer," said the lawyer firmly. "I need you to give me all these recordings today. I will contact Child Protective Services and the district attorney's office. This child needs to be removed from that house immediately." While the two men planned the intervention across the street, the girl lived another day of absolute terror. The aunt had woken up with a particularly severe hangover and discovered that there was no more alcohol at home. Her irritation multiplied when she found new drawings of birds that the child had made on the kitchen wall during the early morning. "How many times do I need to tell you not to get charcoal on the walls?" shouted the woman, holding the girl's arm tightly enough to leave purple marks. "You're a plague, a curse in this house." The child tried to explain, to say that she had dreamed of her mother and that the drawings made her feel less alone in the world, but the words were lost in desperate sobs. At 4 years old, she still didn't fully understand why her aunt hated her so much, why each day brought new physical and emotional pain. "You're going to be locked in the room until I decide what to do with you," continued the aunt, pushing the girl down the dark hallway. "And if I hear even a noise, you'll know a punishment you've never experienced before. The room where the child was locked was small and stuffy, with only a high window that she couldn't reach. There, she curled up in the corner and began to sing her mother's lullaby softly, the melody being her only source of comfort in a world that seemed to have forgotten that she existed. It was this song that the retired teacher heard when she passed by the colonial house on her way to the market. The educator had spent the entire night thinking about the conversation with the girl in the backyard, the marks she had seen on the child's arms, the atmosphere of fear that permeated that house like a toxic cloud. The teacher stopped in front of the gate and listened. The girl's voice was weak, but full of a sadness that made the educator's heart break into millions of pieces. At that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going to the market, the teacher went directly to downtown, where the small office of Child Protective Services was located. She knew the caseworker in charge well, a former student of hers who had dedicated herself to the protection of vulnerable children. "I need to talk to you about a very serious situation," said the educator, entering the office without ceremony. The caseworker looked up from the papers she was analyzing. "Professor, it's good to see you. What brings you here today?" "A child in danger. My neighbor. I'm sure she's being systematically mistreated." The young woman straightened up in her chair, her expression becoming immediately serious. During her 5 years as a caseworker, she had learned to recognize when a complaint was serious, and the former professor was not the type of person who would make frivolous accusations. "Tell me everything," said the caseworker, grabbing a complaint form. While the teacher related her observations, across town, the lawyer was in a similar meeting at the district attorney's office. The prosecutor listened attentively, while the lawyer presented the evidence collected by the millionaire. "This is compelling evidence," said the DA, examining the videos on the cell phone. "I will order an immediate investigation and request the removal of the child from the family environment." "How long will this take?" asked the lawyer, worried about every minute that passed. "With this evidence, we can act today," replied the DA with determination. "I'll contact Child Protective Services now." It was thus that, by a coincidence that would change the girl's destiny, 2 simultaneous complaints arrived at Child Protective Services on the same morning. The caseworker was finishing writing down the teacher's report when her phone rang. "Child Protective Services, how can I help you?" "This is the DA. I need you to make an urgent intervention in a house on Main Street. We have evidence of severe child abuse." The caseworker paused, her pen suspended over the paper. "Is it by any chance the yellow colonial house?" "Exactly. How did you know?" "I just received a complaint about the same house," replied the young woman, looking at the teacher with surprise. "2 independent sources. This confirms the seriousness of the situation." At 2 in the afternoon, a coordinated operation was being set up. The caseworker, accompanied by 2 social workers and a court officer, was heading to the colonial house. The teacher had offered to accompany the team, using her experience with traumatized children. The millionaire watched everything from his window, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, after days of emotional paralysis, he had managed to act. The lawyer was by his side, both witnessing the moment that would change the girl's life forever. "You did the right thing," said the lawyer, placing his hand on his friend's shoulder. "I hope it's not too late," replied the businessman, his eyes fixed on the team approaching the colonial house. When the caseworker knocked on the door of the colonial house and received no answer, she used her legal authority to enter the property. What they found inside surpassed even their worst expectations. A dirty and completely neglected house, an unbearable smell of alcohol mixed with something rotten, and obvious signs of neglect and violence in every room. It was the teacher who first heard the faint voice coming from the room in the back. "There's someone here," she said, guiding the team down the hallway. When they opened the door of the room and found the girl curled up in the corner, singing her sad song, everyone present felt a pang in their hearts that they would never forget. The child raised her big, scared eyes, not understanding who those people were or what they wanted from her. "Hi, sweetheart," said the caseworker, squatting down to be at the child's height. "My name is Anna. We came to help you." The girl looked at the teacher, recognizing the kind lady who had talked to her in the backyard. A glimmer of hope shone in her eyes, but was quickly replaced by conditioned fear. "Auntie's gonna be mad," she whispered. "You don't have to worry about that now," said the educator, reaching out her hand to the girl. "We're going to get out of here, okay?" And so, after 8 months of silent suffering, the child was finally removed from the house, where she had known only pain and fear, beginning a journey that would lead her back to the light she had lost when her parents departed this world, unaware that a millionaire across the street had used all his wealth and influence to save her from a terrible destiny. If you liked this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment on what you thought of my story, giving it a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.